This is a brand new series. If you are new visiting with us, there's no greater time for you to be here. It's like the beginning of a movie, all right? So we're going to set up what the next few weeks look like, and it's good that you're here. We wanted to do something for marriage and the idea of marriage this year. And as we talked about it, we talked about this idea of I want a new marriage and how that would apply to every single person in the room. That if you're single or if you're single again and you're thinking about marriage one day, all right, this is going to be one of those things where we want you to think about a new kind of marriage. That hopefully after the next few weeks, you will be focused in on a new kind of marriage to be dreaming about, to be praying for, and to be looking forward to. And if you're married, 1 year or 20 years, it doesn't matter, 35 years, we hope that over the next few weeks, we're going to talk about some real practical foundational pieces that we know that in every marriage we can always have improvement. We can always work harder and better to fulfill what we know God has called us to be in our marriage, but sometimes it just takes practical work. And so we're going to talk about 3 areas of that over the next few weeks. But in order to do that, kind of like what Steve kind of talked about today, we need to talk about this whole idea of marriage and what God truly created and intended, because this is something that God created. Marriage is an institution that God created, not something that man invented. You guys understand the difference? It's something that God created, not something that man invented. And so we're going to talk about it. If we want to get down to what it looks like in the practical elements of living together, doing life together, married together, we have to talk about it in the healthiest way we can, which is how it was created to function and how it was created to work. And so we're not going to talk about the marriage that we've come to know, because it doesn't really matter how marriage is ever going to be defined by our laws or by our culture, about people who love each other and who want to, be together. We're going to talk about marriage as the way God intended it to be talked about. That's the only way to get down to the health of how we're going to live the rest of our lives together as married couples, all right? And if it's for you, if you've been married, again, if you're married and you're a couple, I know that there's plenty of areas in our lives that need work, and hopefully over the next few weeks, even if you just apply one of these things, you can have a new marriage in 2014. I believe that to be true. But first, it starts with the foundation. The Apostle Paul, actually wrote a really great letter to a church in Ephesus. And that's the majority of the New Testament is Paul's letters to the churches. Well, to this particular church, he writes a really great refrain, if you will, of what marriage looks like and what a husband looks like. Husbands are to do this and are called to be like this, and wives are called to be this, and it looks like this in marriage. And at the very end of that refrain, he actually comes up with this, what we call a definition of marriage. He comes down to the end and says, as the scriptures say, a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united as one. What he's saying, Paul is actually pulling back from what Jesus said, and Jesus was pulling back from what God said in Genesis, this same phrase, the great mystery, that this is a great mystery, but it's an illustration of the way Christ and the church are one, because we just talked about this unity. So again, I say, each man must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. That last sentence is more of a summary of all the things he talks about, which we're going to cover in the next 2 weeks, just not today. That Paul puts this out there and says, marriage was designed in this thing that I like to call it, this idea of oneness. That two people have now come together in such a way that they are now one. That God would view you as one and might actually have a plan to do something in your life as one, as a oneness in your marriage that he does not plan to do in your life individually, but as one. That our culture breathes marriage in such a way that they look at it as a kind of a contract, as kind of a two halves coming together, or two wholes coming together to kind of put 50% of their best effort into each other to kind of create a business relationship and a contractual agreement to kind of work it out that if you hold up your end of the deal and I hold up my end of the deal, we might be able to make this thing work for the rest of our lives. That's what marriages in our culture kind of come together as. And what we see in Paul's writings, he talks about this idea of oneness, the idea that Jesus talked about, the idea that Jesus knew that the Father had in mind when he created marriage. was this idea that no, you're no longer two individual wholes. You are, but you're also now one. And it's called a covenant. This is the idea that it's not a contract, but a covenant in your life between you and your spouse and God. It really sets up what marriage is supposed to look like. Now, before he actually goes into that giant thing about before you talk about roles and responsibilities and who's supposed to do what in a marriage, he ends with this, but he starts with what I like to call really kind of the overall definition. He starts with this phrase in verse 21. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Before he goes into the rant, before he goes into the calls and roles and husbands are to do this and wives are supposed to do this, he starts off by saying marriage starts with the idea of mutual submission. That marriage actually starts with this idea that you're to submit to one another. And I love the fact that he had to put the rest in because, I'll be honest, if he just left it as submit to one another, we usually define that as, that's awesome. I'll do that as long as you're worthy to be submitted to. You know, as long as you're holding up your end of the deal. No, he says, we submit to one another out of our reverence, out of our worship to Christ. That's what marriage is. And it's, again, very different from our culture. Our culture are two, really kind of paint the picture in Hollywood, if you will, of two self-serving individuals who then find that person that sort of meets their needs. And because you both kind of meet each other's needs, you decide to get married. And if things don't work out, what do you normally hear from that? And people who get divorced, people who separate, well, they're just not making me happy anymore, and they're not meeting their needs, not holding up their end of the deal. Because two self-centered people came together in a contract. When he starts off this entire paragraph, before he gets to the idea of oneness, he paints that picture and says, marriage is really about serving one another. That's the way I would term it. Marriage is about serving one another. It's a life of serving someone else. And oftentimes when I talk to premarital couples, and if I sense in their language that I'm sensing that there's not a good idea of what this means, I'll make that statement to the men. Look, if you don't plan on spending the rest of your life serving her, don't get married. Ladies, do not try to fix him. You know what I'm trying to say? Like, nod your head if you're with me, all right? This is not what you're going to spend you're going to spend your life. If you want to have a godly marriage, you're going to spend the rest of your life serving that person. And you're going to serve each other. And that's the foundation by which you're going to have a marriage and a covenant with God. Is serving each other out of reverence for Christ. Now, because of that, because that's the foundation, because that's the framework, if you will, that we look at to the Word of God for a healthy marriage. Now we can begin to talk about maybe some individual pieces that, quite frankly, we just recognize, the Bible recognizes them, we recognize them today as some of the foundational pieces that people struggle with the most in their marriage when it comes to serving one another. That the struggles in marriages come in not being able to serve one another because of some of these foundational pieces are broken and are hurting. And the one we're going to spend the time talking about today is communication. Communication. Talking together, right? That's Al Green. Love is talking together. You know what I'm talking about? Love is walking to... No, yeah, okay, so... It's a great, Love and Happiness. Al Green, go look it up later. Okay, so he knew what he was talking about, right? Love is, and marriages and relationship, the essential part of it is this idea of communication. It honestly is the thing that's going to last forever in your marriage, which is why I feel bad sometimes for our culture, for teenagers and for people, young adults who are trying to honor God in their singleness. But the reality is our culture promotes dating in such a way and relationships in a way that physical nature, the physical side, the sex, the lust, the emotion, the surging, if you will, of us coming together, that's so prominently focused on that people focus so much on that attention in their early parts of their relationship that they forget that they're going to spend the rest of their life figuring out how to talk to each other. That ultimately they're sort of set up for failure when you allow, God knows what he's talking about, when you allow the physical to intrude on your relationship before marriage, Because I can promise you, you talk to any couple after 10 years, you've been married 10 years, that's a great part of marriage, but it ain't the bedrock of anything. You got to learn, eventually when all the heat and the passion and the emotion goes down, you got to stare at somebody's face and learn to talk to them, right? Now, my wife and I really found one of the greatest gifts my wife and I had in our marriage was or in our relationship was that when we were seniors in high school, we dated, but we dated long distance. We were long distance from each other. And I have to explain this a little bit. If you're under 30 years old, I have to explain what this is. We used to have these companies called long distance carriers, okay? And I know you don't understand, so I'm just going to explain it real quick. They were companies that contracted out phone service time, and you had to pay an additional phone service to be able to talk long distance to people. So I was in Florida. Tracy, my wife, she was up here in North Carolina. And my father would he would just get so angry. We'd have these conversations about, how in the world could I talk this long? When we'd look at the minutes that I would talk to Tracy, what could you possibly be talking about? And I'd be like, whatever, Dad. I was trying to pay the bill. I was trying to be good, but I was like, whatever, Dad. We're just talking, we love each other, and we're just talking. We're just listening to each other breathe, and it's like, an hour later, you're like, so what are you doing now? And you're like, I don't know. I'm doing the same thing I was doing. I've been on the phone with you, right? But I do think that one of the greatest things between the letters that we wrote and the phone calls we had, one of the greatest things that we had going for us early on, because we got married young, is the fact that we spent so long learning how to talk to one another. That before we even had the temptations that we had to struggle through physically in our relationships before we got married, we were already communicating. And that's a big deal. And the reason that this is years ago, I saw the proof in this in our culture. I saw the proof come out. Back when the Twilight movies were such a huge thing, and I'd go with Tracy to go watch these movies, and I would see not just teenagers, they were there, but I would see grown, married women, middle-aged, flocking to these movies, just obsessed with the story of a young couple, and it wasn't physical. You guys know the story. Well, they didn't get weird and have a demon baby till later, right? It was what was the most of the stories about? It was about this couple that, would sit in a field 3 inches from each other's face and just communicate and talk. And you'd talk to these women and you'd begin to read stories about this infatuation because there is a longing in our souls to connect through communication, especially in relationships, especially in our marriages. All right? Communication is huge. It's a huge foundational piece of what it looks like for you and your spouse to serve one another. So Paul in Ephesians, in this letter to the church of Ephesus, and early on in chapter 4, he's laying out some foundational pieces of what communication should look like and what it should look like for relationships, and especially for marriage. So Ephesians 4, if you want to turn there, we'll start there. We're going to show some areas that Paul points out. In verse 25, he says, "Stop telling lies. Let us tell our neighbors the truth, for we are all parts of the same body." Element number one that's vital to communication is that we have to tell each other the truth. We have to be honest. And that's not something that, honestly, that I hear in most couples nowadays. This call for honesty and to tell the truth to one another. What I see oftentimes is I see couples who don't have any trouble speaking the truth about their marriage to people. They're just not telling each other the truth about what's going on in their marriage. They're talking about it, ladies, you're talking about it with your friends and over your Bible study, prayer time, and your lunches that, just so you can vent, and, I get all that. But you're sharing the truth. You're being honest in certain areas about your marriage, but you have never, ever, ever said those words to your spouse. And men don't quite easily do the exact same things. When men share about what's really going on, it's a little bit more coarse. It's usually a little bit more raw. But the same thing, they'll share it with a stranger. They'll share it with me or a counselor or somebody about what way they're feeling and the truth about their marriage. But they won't ever share that with their spouse. You got to talk. You got to serve each other by being honest with each other. If your spouse looks at you and says, "What's wrong?" and you say, "Nothing," but there is actually something wrong, you know you're a liar, right? When you look at her and say, sweetie, are you bothered? And she says no, but she really is bothered. She just wants you to play the game, of ask me again, ask me again, ask me again. You're not only a liar, you're a manipulative liar. Okay? You got to speak the truth. Now, maybe you take a moment, maybe it's not the right place over the dinner table to air your grievances, but you got to speak the truth. You got to be honest with one another. I find this funny because when I talk to couples about this, I'll listen to the truth about marriage and what's going on in their life, and then I'll say to her or to him, and I'll say, awesome. So when you talked about that with them, what'd they say? Well, they should just know. I mean, I've hinted about it, 1,000 times. I've told Susan about it. I've told Jim about it. I've told our group in public with him sitting there all about it. He should just know. She should just know. I don't stand for that in any other area of my life. Why would I stand for it in my marriage at home? But did you say it to each other? Listen, your spouse cannot be accountable for unspoken expectations. Okay? Your spouse cannot be accountable for unspoken expectations. That's where you need to be honest. If you haven't done well in communicating in your marriage, it starts here. Be honest with one another. And really, that's where couples say, well, that's where all the fights come from. When I do finally say it, or when I do finally, tell the truth, we just fight. That's where the anger comes. That's where defense comes. And I get that. Part of telling the truth, part of being honest with one another, men, is you have to create a space and an environment in your marriage where the truth can be spoken. And you're not going to rise up in defense. I do it all the time. I get it. But your job is to create a place, not just to tell the truth, but to receive the truth. And ladies, for you, your man has to trust you. He has to trust that if he's going to speak the truth to you, that you're not going to dishonor him the very next day at lunch with your girlfriend telling someone else what he just said. It's up to both of you in this honesty to create the environment so honesty for each other. Why? Because we're called in our marriage to serve one another. That's what it looks like. James says this, James 1:19 says this. It says, understand this, my dear brothers and sisters, you must all be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. Let's just read the last half of the verse together. You ready? Out loud, everyone. You must all be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. Write that on your forehead. See it in the mirror. You want to work on telling the truth? You be quick to listen. Slow to speak. Slow to respond. And slow to anger. We're going to talk about anger in a minute, but that's a big part of being honest with each other. And let me just add this one more thing, because we're going to talk about it towards the end. Guys, honesty paves the way to intimacy. Honesty paves the way to intimacy. And if that's an area in your marriage where you're struggling, then I don't even know you, but I can pretty much be assured that you're not communicating and serving one another in communication by being honest with each other and telling the truth to each other. Because honesty paves the way for you to enjoy what God has blessed you with in marriage, is that intimacy that you both desire and both need to breathe life. Next, in Ephesians 4, talks about being honest. He goes on to say this, and don't sin by letting anger control you. Don't let the sun go down on you while you're still angry, for anger gives a foothold to the devil. The second part of communication in terms of this idea is you need to learn in your relationship, in your communication as you serve one another, to settle or table the issue that you've got a disagreement about. Now, it doesn't say don't get angry because you're both broken, like sinning people, okay? So that you're both broken, selfish to a degree, people living in close proximity to each other, you're going to argue. You're going to have, anger rise up. You're going to have disagreements. It's just the way it is. We'll talk about it in the next few weeks. You're not even wired the same way. You're not going to look at things the same way. They're going to come up. The Bible's command is not don't get angry because we'd all lose, right? It's don't let anger control you. Don't sin by letting anger sit in your soul. Don't let the sun go down on it. Don't let the sun go down on an argument that you're having and a fight you're having with your spouse. That's a big, big deal in terms of solving it or really settling it or tabling the issue. Now, this is a mini sermon. I won't preach it right now, but anger, honestly, your anger issues are a sin issue because they're a selfishness issue. When I talk to couples, and they're like, well, he's got a short fuse or she's got a quick temper and it doesn't take much, and all of a sudden their head spins off, and I get that. Let me just be honest. Your anger issues are selfishness issues. There's no reason to take offense unless you think you're all that, okay? And that's why young people fight all the time, and you get married. My wife and I are married 20 years, and it's not because we're humble. We've been humbled. You understand? We've been humbled. We don't think we're all that of anything anymore. So we take less offense and quick to rise to the, oh yeah, arguments. Like you are when you're 20 and you don't know anything. You don't know any better. Understand that anger in you, that sin controlling you in anger, is really just a selfishness thing. And this idea of don't let the sun go down is this idea of don't play the silent game. Don't play the silent treatment. That was cute in kindergarten. It really, really was. But it's not when you're an adult. Don't let anger sit in your soul. Don't let it, how many do this? Like the issue happens and you get angry and you don't say anything because you're not being truthful, number one. And it sits there. And before you've ever brought it up, you've had 3 imaginary conversations about what it's going to look like, right? Who else does that? It's not just me, right? I'm not crazy. 3 imaginary conversations, and then you blow it all up in your spouse, and then they get all defensive because it comes out of nowhere. And all of a sudden, the enemy has had a foothold in your marriage, in your communication, in your serving one another. Because you've allowed the issue, the argument, the anger to sit. I'm telling you, it's an intentional practice that before you go to bed, you settle it. Now, I understand there are big issues in life, and sometimes, my wife and I have discovered this over years, there are issues that you're just not going to solve tonight. But you can table the issue. You can table that discussion. One of the greatest reliefs that my wife and I ever had for each other as we serve one another is the ability to give each other the permission to be angry, to table an issue and to be angry at the issue and not angry with each other. That we're allowed to be angry because that thing sucks and that thing's real and that thing's not working and this thing's causing stress on our life. But when you don't have that freedom, when you don't table it or really work intentionally to settle that issue, then the enemy has an opportunity to whisper to you and you think that you're against each other and because he's an idiot and he doesn't know what he's thinking of and why is she thinking that way? And the enemy's whispering in your ears and they're against you, they're not for you. And you need to remember, you're serving each other, you're on the same team. You can be angry and you can be frustrated and you can have a disagreement. But be really intentional about we are not going to let this sit between you and me. We're going to settle it. Or we're going to table it because it's a big issue. And we're allowed to be frustrated at that. We're allowed to be frustrated at that, but not be frustrated with each other. In Proverbs, it says this. A gentle answer turns away what? Wrath. But a harsh word does what? Stirs up anger. Here's the deal. If you've been married longer than a year, there's these things called buttons. And when you're young, it's like a sport. You know what I'm saying? Like you push the buttons and watch them go. Don't push their buttons. Don't prolong something for the immediate sense of a victory. Because you pushed that button and you got them to feel guilty and you got them to get angry about something else. Don't be satisfied with what you think would be a small victory when you've allowed anger to sit in your relationship. Don't push each other's buttons. Okay, I know they're there. I have buttons. My wife has buttons. We know what they are. Okay, we know what they are. I mean, she's even called me out when I've pushed it once. She's just like, how dare you push that button? How dare you push it? You know that's a button. And I'm like, yeah, I confess, you're right. It was all uncalled for. Don't do that. A gentle answer is going to turn away that anger. Don't use those harsh words. Don't push those buttons and let it stir up. Let's continue on in Ephesians. It says, don't use foul or abusive language. Let everything you say be good and helpful, so that your words will be encouragement to those who hear them. Get rid of all the bitterness, all the rage, anger, harsh words, slander, as well as all types of evil behavior. Instead, what's to say? Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, just as God, through Christ, has forgiven you. We submit to one another out of our reverence for Christ. We forgive one another. We're kind to one another. We're encouraging to one another out of our reverence for Christ. Just like He's done for us, we do for our mate and our spouse. The third element here is just you always use words to lift up. Never talk down. Use your words to lift each other up. That's what communication and serving each other in your marriage looks like. You don't talk each other down. Listen, I get it. I know sometimes that he's just an idiot and he just looks dumb today, and you just, for women, you just rises up and you just begin to talk down to your spouse. I'm telling you, it's poison for your marriage. And my wife and I struggle the most when I'm having to, on the phone or whatever, talk to her about something technical. She's not this technically minded, and she gets frustrated easily, and I can just feel myself rising up and beginning to talk down to her. And it doesn't do any good. It's so poisonous to the foundation of serving her. Our words are called to be used to encourage each other, to forgive one another, to be helpful, it says. Is what you're saying going to be helpful? Well, then don't say that. And don't talk down. Here's another part of it. Don't use slander, bitterness, or harsh words about your spouse to someone else. Don't do that. I can just tell you right now, you're not gaining anyone's respect. Oh, the guys are laughing and you threw something out and it was a good little zinger against your wife. That's awesome. You have gained no respect. Okay, because the deep down in us, we don't like it. We really don't. But I'm telling you, you talk up your spouse, you speak encouragingly and lovingly all the time to lift them up. That is something people pay attention to. Because it's what they long for. It's what they long for their spouse to do for them. It's what they long to learn to be able to do for their spouse one day. You always use words to lift up and never, ever to tear down. There are three areas, and this is what I want to cover before we close our time out. Because if marriage really is this idea of serving one another, and if in the area of communication in our marriage, we know there's just areas, specific areas that we're always going to be struggling to communicate in, then let's at least call them out. Let's call them out from years of observation, from years of counseling, and people saying, here's the areas in which husbands and wives forget to communicate. They abandon what they know they need to do in communicating in these areas, and that is where divorce comes, and that is where strife comes, and that is where this sort of life-sucking, existence in marriage comes from, is we do not talk to each other. We're not honest. We allow anger to sit, and we talk down, and we don't build up in these three areas. And the first one's money. Just raise your hand if you have ever had a conversation with your wife or spouse about money. Right? Don't raise your hand now. How many have ever argued about it? It just happens. Listen, it happens for all sorts of reasons. Men and women spend money differently, right? We have different responsibilities. It's all weird. I got married really young, and I don't think I'd ever paid more than $7 for a haircut. And I got married to my wife, and I saw the first time she got her haircut. And I was confused. And I was like, did they detail the car while you were there? Like, I'm not sure. I'm just telling you a little one. That's a little argument. that we've had over money over the years. Money's a big deal. Financial stress is a very real thing for every marriage. And if you don't learn how to be honest, how to have a conversation about money, even things that frustrate you and you don't agree about, and not let anger sit in your marriage, not talk down to one another because one of you is the money expert and one of you is an idiot who goes into debt. You know what I'm saying? Like, you don't allow that to happen. You speak life and health and hope into someone that you're married to as you serve one another. If you can't talk about money and continue to communicate in a healthy way about money, it's going to be there for the rest of your life. I can actually say from God's perspective, number one, that if you don't put God first in your finances, it doesn't matter how great of a communicator you are with each other, you're always going to argue about money. That's just the way it is. If you don't put God first and understand stewardship and what it means, if you're single and the first question you don't ask the person you're thinking about marrying is, do they tithe? Are they generous? Do they understand stewardship about money? Do not marry that person, because you will spend the rest of your life having financial stress and arguing about money, regardless of how good you communicate. And the reason we offer Dave Ramsey and Financial Peace University is because we believe there's other ways to relieve stress and financial stress, like getting out of debt. I'm just telling you, you learn how to put God first in your finances and you get out of debt, your financial stress and arguments about money go from major to nothing. They go from like all the time to we haven't argued in years about money. Because it's that important. And it's one of the areas that if you want to serve one another, if that's the godly marriage you want to have and a life serving one another, you've got to learn to talk about money. Got to learn. Second area is sex. You got to be able to talk about it. If you're single, you're not allowed to talk about it. That's what God says. But if you're married, you have to be able to talk about it. Why? Because if a marriage is about serving one another, how are you going to serve one another if you don't talk about it? How's that possible? Man, if you're getting your tips from Men's Health or online or tips and tricks and 30 whatever, you're a loser. Okay, can I just say that? They don't know you. They don't know your wife. They don't know your relationship. They don't know anything. It's all from the cultural perspective. You need to have a conversation with your spouse because you serve each other. You hear me? Here's what I know. Ladies have a hard time sometimes talking about it because anyone that's under 30 or 40 years old, you've been raised in a culture where it's been degrading. I mean, what our culture has done in terms of emotion and sex and physically is degraded women. And so it's hard. It's hard for them to talk about it the way they need to be honest. And so, men, ladies, you have to be open to having those conversations, and men, you have to make that a safe place to speak the truth, to be able to talk to one another. Here's what I know about you when I don't even know you, that if you aren't talking about it, you are already on paths leading away from each other for the rest of your life. That all of a sudden it becomes months and it becomes years, and you are cohabitating and managing children. And you've lost the intimacy, the precious gift that God gave marriages to breathe life into your souls. You have got to be able to talk about it. You have to. And the third is time. Time's a big deal. Time's one of those things where in the chaos and noise of life, if you cannot serve your spouse by talking honestly about time and the time family does and takes, and if you can't do that, you're going to just spend a lot of time arguing, upset, fighting, reacting, responding. One of the best things my wife and I learned, and I don't remember where we learned it specifically, but we just got into this habit. I think somebody else did it, and we started doing it. But we've been doing it for years now, and it's a stress reliever for us. Is we just at the end of our week or the beginning of our week, whether it's Saturday or Sunday, and it's not sexy. It's just we get the calendars out and we have a few minutes where we talk about time. We talk about what the week looks like with kids and parties and birthday parties and meetings for church and, all the things going on. And we talk about time because we want to serve each other and we want to value the time that we will have. So we don't spend the whole week just bouncing around and reacting and what do you mean? And I told you and didn't you say and didn't you know and why didn't you forget? And we talk about it and there's certain weeks where we just smile at each other. We're like, man, this is going to be a good week. It's going to be a good week. Let's be intentional about how we use our time with each other, with our family, with friends. Some weeks are just, it's life. Life is hard. And some weeks, time is stressed. And you've got this, and we've got double things going on this night, and we've got this and this. And we look at each other, and we're honest, and we say, gosh, this is going to be a hard week. It's going to be a hard week because the quantity of time is not there, so we better make sure that the quality is there. That's mostly my failure at night when the kids go to bed. I need to make sure my computer's away and my phones are done, and we can spend quality time together talking, okay, communicating. Time's a big deal. When's the last time you looked at your spouse and said to them, how much time do you need from me this week? You're not asking that for like a minimalist kind of answer. To serve your spouse, you say, honey, what do you need from me? What can I do to serve you this week with my time? And time's a hard thing because for men and women, there are two primary things that suck away our time, and there's a reason. For men, it's mostly work. And the reason work monopolizes our time is because at work, we are either served at work or it is self-serving to work. That's what it is for me. I'm very goal-driven and, got ideas and I could work all the time because it's self-serving. But when I leave work, I go home, it's serve time. It's get dinner ready time. It's clean this up time. It's wipe whatever's off your son time. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's serve time. Go shower the kids. It's serve time. It's nothing. It ain't about you anymore. And so why? So men stay at work just that hour longer. They have to take that call. If we're not careful, work will monopolize our time. But ladies, here's the other part for you. If you're not careful, children will monopolize your time. And it's complex because for some, it's an emotional dependency that you've allowed to foster with your children, that all of a sudden you're needing and requiring from your children what you should be getting from your spouse. And so therefore your children monopolize your time because it's feeding an emotional need for you that should be served by your spouse. And so men and women, if we're not careful about our time will be a constant state of stress and a constant state of arguing, a constant state of anger if you don't talk to one another, if you don't learn to communicate with each other, to be honest, to not let anger be there. Don't sin in anger controlling you. And to always lift up with your words. Always be helpful and forgiving and truthful and never bitter and rage and slander and harsh words. In money and sex and your time. We're going to be done in just a minute. That's your goal today. That's your only thing. If you're single, here's what I want you to do. I want you to write down a few questions you want to ask that person that you want to marry one day. Things like, do you tithe? Do you have anything in your life in terms of past where you've been abused or you're bringing sexual things and sexual baggage into the relationship? Do you have any of those things? Third, how do you handle your time? How do you manage your time? Do you understand what it is for a marriage for time? I want you to write those things down and have an idea for you about what you want to see happen in your marriage. But today, if you're married, not necessarily at lunch, give each other a little space. I want you to picture a serving towel over your arm. And I want you to spend 30 whole minutes, face to face, having a conversation with each other in one of these three areas. Now, I already know which one the men are going to pick. Go this way. Have a conversation in at least one of these three areas. Put that serving towel over your arm and say, how can I serve you? And say it to each other. Maybe the first thing that needs to happen is you need to recognize that there's not a serving heart in you. because you've lost that idea of what Christ has done for you and how he has served you, and the love that's coming out of you is not coming from him. And so maybe the first thing that's going to happen today when you have that conversation is you need to already have had a conversation with God and a little bit of prayer time with God so that you can confess to your spouse that there's not a serving heart in me right now. I've not been serving you well. You need to have that time with God so that you can confess it to them, and that could be the first jumping off point of being honest with each other. I've not served you well in this area. I've not served you well in conversation. I've not served you well with slander and harsh words and pushing your buttons. I want to do better and spend 30 minutes talking together, having a conversation, learning what it is to communicate in such a way that is foundational to the way God designed your marriage to be, which is serving one another out of reverence for Christ. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, we thank you for today. We thank you for your word, that it's powerful. That God, even though we can pull apart and work on some practical things, we know this, God, just from what's happening in our marriages and in our lives, that these practical areas you want to work in and through us, God, to make better, to be better. But God, first and foremost, instill into our hearts, instill into our souls the fact that our marriage, the way you've designed it in this idea of oneness, is to be one that submits to one another because of who you are in us. Jesus, change our hearts and move us to a place as we talk today, as we pray and write down questions today, as we think about the future today. Give us a new marriage and a new idea of what marriage can be because of who you are, Jesus. And it's in your name we pray. Amen.
We hope you've enjoyed engaging in our worship experience. Everything we do at Journey is to help make a difference in people's lives. If God has been moving and working in your life, we would love to hear your story. You can share it with us at mystory@thejourneyonline.com. If you would like to invest in the ministry and mission at Journey Church, you can give online at thejourneyonline.com. Thank you for investing in the lives that are changing at Journey Church.